Thomas Granger stood in the doorway of the old barn, watching his breath crystallize in the November air before dissolving into nothing. The ancient thermometer his father had nailed to the weathered post 40 years ago read 28 degrees, and the sun hadn't even reached its highest point yet. Too cold, too soon. The kind of cold that settled deep into your bones and whispered warnings about what was coming. Warnings that men like Thomas had learned not to ignore. The wind pushed down from the ridge above Willow Ridge, carrying with it the sharp scent of coming snow and the dry rattle of dead leaves still clinging stubbornly to the oak trees that lined the property. Through the gaps in the barn's wooden slats, gaps that Thomas kept meaning to patch but never quite got around to, thin streams of pale sunlight cut through the dusty air, illuminating particles of hay and the slow, deliberate movements of the barn's sole occupant. Rust. The old bull shifted his considerable weight from one leg to another, hooves scraping against the worn straw bedding with a sound that was as familiar to Thomas as his own heartbeat. 16 years old now, ancient for a bull, practically prehistoric. His coat, once the deep, vibrant red of fresh clay, had faded over the years to the color of rust and old copper pennies, stretched tight over muscles that were still powerful, but moved with increasing caution. His massive head, crowned with horns that had been filed down years ago for safety, turned slowly toward Thomas, and their eyes met with the quiet understanding that comes from decades of shared survival. Thomas crossed the barn floor, his boots leaving prints in the scattered straw, and placed his calloused hand on Rust's broad shoulder. The animal's hide was warm beneath his palm, radiating a heat that the cold November air was already working to steal away. He could feel the bull's heartbeat, slow and steady, reliable as sunrise. "Getting colder out there, old friend," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough from years of speaking more to animals than to people. "You feel it in your bones, don't you? I know I do." Russ let out a long breath through his nostrils, twin plumes of white vapor that hung in the cold air for a moment before dissipating. His joints were clearly stiff. Thomas could see it in the careful way he positioned his back legs, the slight favoring of his right side. Arthritis, most likely. The same thing that made Thomas's own hands ache on mornings like this. Age was democratic that way, affecting man and beast with equal indifference. The barn door creaked open behind him, the rusty hinges protesting with a sound that echoed off the wooden walls. Miriam stepped inside, arms wrapped tight around herself despite the faded blue cardigan she wore, the same one she'd been wearing for 15 years, the cuffs frayed to threads, the elbows worn thin. Thomas had offered more times than he could count to buy her a new one, but she always refused. "This one's still good," she'd say, and that would be the end of it. "You coming in for lunch?" Miriam asked, her voice carrying that permanent edge of exhaustion that had crept in somewhere over the years. The weight of decades spent working this hard land had settled into her shoulders, bowing them slightly, but her eyes were still sharp, still missing nothing. "In a few minutes," Thomas replied, not taking his hand off Rust's shoulder. Miriam's gaze moved from her husband to the old bull, and something like concern, or maybe resignation, crossed her lined face. "He's old, Tom. You know that as well as I do." "I know. This winter's supposed to be the worst we've had since the 70s. Maybe worse. I heard on the radio this morning that the Weather Service is already talking about record lows, sustained cold, the whole 9 yards. She pulled the cardigan tighter, as if the very mention of the coming cold could make the barn colder. "They're saying it could get down to -15, maybe lower." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He just kept his hand on Rust's shoulder, feeling the warmth radiating from the animal's massive body, thinking about how thin the barn walls were, how the wind would cut right through them come January, how an animal this old, with joints this stiff, wouldn't survive temperatures like that without help. Miriam sighed, a sound heavy with all the worries she carried. "If he doesn't make it through this winter..." "He'll make it," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable firmness that left no room for argument. "You can't know that for certain, Tom. I know him. I know what he's survived before. He'll make it through this too." Miriam shook her head slowly, that look of tired resignation settling over her features like a familiar mask. It was the same look she got when the property tax notice came, when the truck needed repairs they couldn't afford, when life on this mountain threw another problem their way that had no easy solution. Lunch is on the table. Don't let it get cold like you did yesterday." She turned without waiting for a response and walked back out into the November chill, the barn door swinging shut behind her with a groan of protesting wood and rusty metal. The sound echoed in the empty space, and then Thomas was alone again with rust and the wind and his own thoughts. That night, long after the sun had set behind the western ridge and darkness had swallowed the valley whole, Thomas sat at the scarred kitchen table that had belonged to his parents and their parents before them. The wood was marked with decades of use, knife marks from hasty meals, water rings from countless coffee cups, initials carved by children long grown. In front of him sat a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten while he studied the almanac his grandfather had pressed into his 6-year-old hands more than 50 years ago. The book was falling apart. The pages had turned yellow and brittle with age, threatening to crumble if handled too roughly. The leather binding, once supple and rich brown, was now cracked and dry, held together more by electrical tape and stubborn refusal to die than by any structural integrity. But the information inside, the accumulated knowledge of generations who had survived these mountains before central heating, before electricity, before anyone thought the old ways were something to laugh at or dismiss, was still as solid and reliable as bedrock. Thomas turned carefully to the section on winter preparation, running his finger down the faded text until he found what he was looking for. There, in the margins, written in his grandfather's cramped, precise handwriting, were the words he'd been searching for. "Mud and straw hold heat better than any modern insulation money can buy. Build thick, build patient, build it right, and it'll outlast you and your children both." He remembered being 7 years old, small for his age, following his grandfather around the property during a winter that had tried to kill everything it touched. He remembered watching the old man mix clay from the creek bed with straw from the previous harvest, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, never wasting a motion. He remembered watching those same hands apply the mixture to the walls of the root cellar, the chicken coop. Anywhere they desperately needed to hold warmth against a winter that showed no mercy. And he remembered most clearly of all how everything his grandfather had protected that way had survived when other farms in the valley had lost livestock, lost crops, lost hope. "What are you reading there, Dad?" Thomas looked up to find Luke standing in the kitchen doorway, smartphone clutched in his hand like a lifeline, illuminating his face with that cold blue glow. His son was 34 years old now, college-educated, working remotely for some tech company in Pittsburgh that Thomas didn't understand and couldn't pronounce. Luke visited the farm just often enough to make it clear how much smarter, how much more modern, how much more enlightened he was than his old-fashioned father who still read almanacs and trusted in things written before computers existed. "Grandpa's almanac," Thomas said simply, his voice neutral. Luke stepped into the kitchen, glancing at the worn book with that familiar expression of bemused tolerance that made Thomas's jaw tighten involuntarily. "Dad, you know there are apps for all that now, right? Weather forecasts accurate down to the hour. Temperature predictions, precipitation models, frost warnings, the whole works. You don't have to rely on some old book that doesn't even—" "This book has kept this family alive for over 100 years, Thomas interrupted, his voice still quiet but now carrying an edge of steel underneath that made Luke stop mid-sentence. "It kept your great-grandparents alive through winters that killed neighbors on both sides. It kept your grandfather alive through the Depression. It kept me and your mother alive when we had nothing but this land and the knowledge in these pages." Luke held up both hands in that gesture of mock surrender that never failed to irritate Thomas. "Hey, I'm not attacking your traditions, Dad. I'm just saying, technology exists for good reasons. Science, data, satellites." "So does this," Thomas said, closing the almanac with deliberate care, his calloused fingers gentle on the fragile pages. "So does this." Luke shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation, already looking back down at his glowing phone screen where something infinitely more important than his father's concerns was undoubtedly happening. "Whatever you say, Dad. Mom told me to tell you dinner's ready in 20 minutes. She made that pot roast you like." He wandered back out of the kitchen, and Thomas could hear his footsteps on the stairs, hear the creak of the old floorboards that had never been properly fixed, hear the distant sound of his bedroom door closing. And then silence again, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of Miriam moving around in the kitchen, preparing a meal that would be eaten mostly in silence like all their meals these days. Thomas sat alone in the empty kitchen with the almanac open in front of him and made a decision that would change everything for everyone in Willow Ridge. He would build a mud wall around Rust's barn, layer by patient layer, exactly the way his grandfather had taught him all those decades ago. Thick enough to trap the bull's body heat, solid enough to stand against the howling mountain wind that would come screaming down from the ridge when January arrived. Dense enough to hold warmth when the temperature dropped to -15 or lower. It would take weeks of backbreaking work. His hands would crack and bleed from the cold. His back would scream in protest. His family would think he had finally completely lost his mind to age and stubbornness. But Rust would survive the winter. And that was all that mattered. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the sky pressed low over the valley like a lid on a pot. Thomas was at the creek bed behind the property before the sun had fully risen, his breath creating small clouds that hung in the still air before dissolving. The ground was already starting to freeze. He could feel it resist the bite of his shovel, each scoop requiring more force than the last. The clay here was good, dark and dense, the kind his grandfather had called honest clay because it didn't lie about what it could do. Thomas filled the old wheelbarrow slowly, methodically, his shoulders protesting with each load. He was 61 years old. His body remembered every hard year of that number. By mid-morning, Miriam found him there, mud splattered up to his elbows, sweat on his brow despite the cold. "Tom, what in God's name are you doing?" Her voice carried equal parts confusion and concern. "Digging clay." "I can see that. Why?" "Building a wall, around the barn, mud and straw, like Grandpa showed me. It'll hold the heat in when the cold comes." Miriam stared at him as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. "You're building a mud wall? In November? For that barn?" "For Rust." She let out a long breath that might have been a sigh or might have been something closer to despair. "Tom, that's..." She stopped herself, seemed to search for words that wouldn't sound too harsh. "That's not practical. We have electric heaters. We have insulation we could buy. We don't have to build walls out of mud like we're living in the 1800s. Thomas kept digging, his movements steady and deliberate. "Electric goes out in a bad storm. Did last winter, remember? 3 days without power. This won't go out." "This is crazy," Miriam said quietly. "You know people are going to talk." "Let them talk." She stood there for a long moment, watching him work, and Thomas could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. Worry about his health. Worry about what the neighbors would say. Worry about what it meant that her husband was out here digging in frozen ground to build something that made no sense to the modern world. Finally, she turned and walked back toward the house, her shoulders tight with unspoken arguments. By noon, the phone calls started. Clara first, Thomas's sister, her voice sharp through the receiver that Miriam held away from her ear. "Is it true? Is Thomas really out there building some kind of mud hut?" Then the neighbors. The Hendersons from 2 properties over, the Wilsons from down the ridge. Word traveled fast in a valley this small, carried on the wind and telephone lines with equal speed. When Luke came down for lunch, he stood at the kitchen window watching his father push another wheelbarrow load of clay toward the barn. He shook his head, fingers already moving across his phone screen. "This is insane," he muttered. "I'm looking at better solutions right now. Portable propane heaters, $79. Insulated thermal blankets, $45. Heated livestock mats." "Your father's made up his mind," Miriam said quietly. "His mind is stuck in the last century." Little Ellie, visiting for the week, pressed her face against the window. "Why is Grandpa playing in the mud, Daddy?" Luke's laugh was unkind. "Because he's stubborn and old-fashioned and thinks he knows better than everyone else." Outside, Thomas heard none of this. He just kept working, kept mixing clay with straw, kept applying it to the barn wall with his bare hands, one careful layer at a time. And in the barn, Rust watched through the window, patient and trusting, while the temperature continued to drop. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of Thomas rising before dawn, working until his hands bled, applying layer after patient layer of mud and straw to the barn walls. The structure was slowly transforming. What had been weathered gray wood was now becoming something else entirely, something older and more primal. The wall was 12 inches thick now, dense and solid. Thomas mixed the clay with chopped straw in precise ratios his grandfather had taught him, adding just enough water to make it workable, but not so much that it would crack when it dried. Each handful was pressed firmly against the wood, smoothed with careful strokes, allowed to cure before the next layer went on. His hands were a disaster. The skin had cracked from the cold and constant moisture, deep fissures that reopened every morning when he started work. Miriam had stopped offering him gloves. He'd only refused them anyway, saying he needed to feel the clay, needed to know when the consistency was right. The mockery had evolved from phone calls to visits. Neighbors would drive by slowly, staring. Some would stop, offer unsolicited advice about modern heating solutions. Thomas would nod politely and keep working. One afternoon, Clara arrived unannounced, stepping carefully around mud puddles in her good shoes. She watched him work for several minutes before speaking. "Thomas, people are worried about you. People should worry about their own business. You're 61 years old, out here in freezing weather, building something that makes no sense." Her voice softened slightly. "It's not 1920 anymore. You don't have to do things the hard way." Thomas paused, his mud-covered hands resting against the wall. "Hard way and right way aren't always different things, Clara. This is about that bull, isn't it? Tom, he's just an animal. He's old. If he doesn't make it through winter, he's not just an animal." Thomas's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made Clara step back slightly. "He's been with me longer than most people stay married. He survived the drought of '07. He survived the flood in 12. He'll survive this winter, too." Clara opened her mouth to argue, saw the set of her brother's jaw, and closed it again. Some battles couldn't be won with words. Luke's visits were worse. He'd stand at a distance, filming on his phone, occasionally making comments to whoever he was video chatting with. "Yeah, this is my dad. No, I'm not kidding. He's literally building a mud hut in 2024. I know, right?" Thomas ignored him. Let the boy have his jokes. Time would tell who was right. Even Miriam had mostly stopped trying to talk him out of it. She'd simply leave coffee in a thermos by the barn door each morning, along with sandwiches at lunch. No words, just the small acknowledgement that she couldn't stop him, but she could at least try to keep him alive while he did whatever this insane thing was. By early December, the wall was complete. 18 inches thick at its base, tapering to 12 inches at the top, smooth on the inside where it faced the barn's interior, rough on the outside where Thomas had pressed straw into the surface for additional insulation. It surrounded the entire barn like a protective embrace. The structure looked ancient, like something that had been there for centuries rather than weeks. The clay had dried to a deep earthy brown, the straw creating intricate patterns across the surface. It was ugly by modern standards, impractical by contemporary measures. But it was done. Thomas stood back, surveying his work with his bleeding hands and aching back, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Inside the barn, Rust stood near the wall, and even the old bull seemed to sense something had changed. The air inside was noticeably warmer, the wind no longer cutting through as it had before. Thomas placed his hand on the thick mud wall. It was cool to the touch, but he could already feel what it would do when the real cold came. It would hold. It would protect. The first real storm was forecast for the weekend. Temperatures predicted to drop into the single digits, possibly below zero. Everyone in Willow Ridge was preparing, checking generators, stocking up on supplies, making sure their modern heating systems were ready. And Thomas just stood beside his mud wall, patient and quiet, waiting for winter to show him whether the old ways still worked. The blizzard hit Willow Ridge on a Saturday night in mid-December, arriving with the fury of something that had been building for weeks. The wind came first, howling down from the ridge with a sound like freight trains shaking the farmhouse windows in their frames. Then the snow, thick, heavy flakes that quickly became a white wall, erasing the world beyond the porch. By Sunday morning, 2 feet had fallen. By afternoon, 3. The temperature plummeted to 8 below zero, then 10, then 12, the kind of cold that killed. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, watching the storm rage, and felt Miriam come up beside him. "Power's out," she said quietly. "Henderson called before the lines went down, said half the valley's dark. Generators are running, but who knows for how long." Thomas nodded, his breath fogging the cold glass. "Rust? You can't go out there in this, Tom." But he was already pulling on his coat, wrapping a scarf around his face, pushing out into the screaming white chaos. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his eyes water instantly. He could barely see the barn, just a dark shape in the swirling snow. The walk that normally took 30 seconds took 5 minutes, fighting through drifts that reached his thighs, wind that tried to push him backwards. When he finally reached the barn door and hauled it open, the difference was immediate and shocking. It was warm. Not summer warm, not even comfortable warm, but warm enough that his frozen face began to tingle as circulation returned. Warm enough that he could breathe without pain. Warm enough that Rust stood calm and steady in his stall, not shivering, not suffering. Thomas pulled the small thermometer from his coat pocket, the one he'd placed inside the barn 3 weeks ago. 28 degrees. Outside it was 12 below. The mud wall was holding 40 degrees of difference, 40 degrees of life. He ran his hand along Rust's neck. The bull was warm, his breathing steady, his eyes calm. Not a trace of distress. Thomas felt something break loose in his chest, something that might have been relief or vindication, or just the simple knowledge that the old ways still worked when they needed to. By Monday, the storm hadn't let up. The entire valley was buried, roads impassable, power still out across most of the ridge. The farmhouse was cold, the wood stove keeping the main room barely tolerable, but the bedrooms frigid, water in the bathroom sink frozen solid. Miriam stood at the window, wrapped in every blanket she owned, watching her breath cloud in the air. Luke called on the cell before it died. Said they lost heat at his place. "He's worried about the pipes." "He can come here," Thomas said from his chair near the wood stove. "They all can," Miriam said slowly, understanding dawning. "Can't they?" By Tuesday afternoon, Luke arrived first. Ellie bundled in his arms, both of them shaking with cold. Then Clara with her husband, their modern house with its electric heat pump useless without power. Then the Hendersons, then the Wilsons, then families Thomas barely knew, all of them having heard somehow that the Granger farm had warmth. And they did. Because the barn, with its ancient mud walls, radiated heat into the farmhouse through the shared wall. Because Thomas had built something that didn't need electricity or generators or any modern convenience to work. 23 people crowded into the farmhouse that night, sharing space near the wood stove, sharing food from Thomas's carefully stocked pantry, sharing the warmth that the mud wall provided. Luke stood near the barn door, staring at the thick earthen structure his father had built, understanding finally crossing his face. "Dad," he said quietly. "How did you know?" Thomas was in the barn, checking on Rust one more time before dark. He looked at his son through the doorway, and in the dim light of the kerosene lamp, his weathered face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, just quiet acceptance. "Didn't know," he said simply. "Just remembered." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the mud walls, life went on. Warm, safe, protected by knowledge older than any of them, proven once again to be exactly what was needed when everything modern failed. The storm finally broke on Thursday morning, revealing a valley transformed into something unrecognizable. A world of white silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice-laden branches surrendering to gravity. The 23 people who had sheltered at the Granger farm emerged slowly, blinking in the brilliant sunlight reflecting off endless snow. They had survived. Not just survived, they had stayed warm, fed, safe, all because of a mud wall that everyone had mocked. Thomas stood in the barn doorway, watching them prepare to leave now that the roads were being cleared. Luke approached first, Ellie holding his hand, both of them bundled against the cold that was finally, slowly, beginning to release its grip. "Dad, Luke started, then stopped. Words seemed insufficient for what needed to be said. "I was wrong. About everything. About the wall, about the old ways, about—" His voice cracked slightly. "About you." Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You weren't wrong to question. That's how people learn. You were just wrong about what had the answers. Clara came next, her usual sharp edges softened by 3 days of dependence on the brother she'd called crazy. Thomas, I don't know how to apologize for... Don't need apologies, Thomas said quietly. Just needed you safe. That's all that mattered. Henderson, the neighbor from 2 properties over, stopped on his way out. Tom, I've been farming these mountains for 40 years. Thought I knew everything worth knowing. He gestured at the mud wall. Guess I forgot that some knowledge doesn't get old. It just gets ignored. Thank you for remembering. By afternoon, the farmhouse was empty again except for Thomas, Miriam, and Rust in his warm barn. Miriam stood beside her husband, looking at the structure that had saved not just their bull, but their entire community. You knew, she said softly. All along you knew this would happen. Thomas shook his head. Didn't know about the storm. Just knew the cold was coming. Always does. Always will. And I knew what worked before would work again. Why didn't you explain? Why didn't you tell them what you were doing? Would they have believed me? Thomas asked, and they both knew the answer. Miriam leaned against him, something she hadn't done in years. I'm sorry I doubted you. You were worried. That's what people who love each other do. Inside the barn, Rust shifted in his stall, content and warm, having weathered the worst winter in 50 years without suffering, without fear, protected by something as simple and ancient as mud and straw, and one man's refusal to forget. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt. Life would return to normal. But something had changed in Willow Ridge that winter. People started asking Thomas questions about old techniques, about traditional methods, about the wisdom their grandparents had known that was slowly being lost to modern convenience. Luke brought Ellie by more often. Sometimes he'd find his father in the barn, and instead of scrolling through his phone, he'd ask questions. Real questions. And Thomas would answer, passing down knowledge the way his grandfather had passed it to him, the way it was meant to be passed, hand to hand, generation to generation, tested by time and proven by survival. The mud wall stood through that winter and into spring, through the summer heat and the following autumn. It stood as Thomas had known it would, not forever perhaps, but long enough. Long enough to prove that some things don't need to be modern to work. Some things just need to be remembered. On a cold evening in late November, nearly a year after the great storm, Thomas stood in the barn with Rust, running his hand along the old bull's neck. The animal was another year older, another year slower. But he'd survived. They both had. One more winter, old friend? Thomas asked quietly. And somehow, in the warm air inside the mud walls, with the first snow of the season beginning to fall outside, that seemed like the only answer that mattered.